Hey everybody, it's You Had to Ask, the show where I answer your questions. And this week's first question comes to me from My Thousand Faces, although it was a very popular question asked by many people in the comments for the previous video. And it, of course, pertains to the big nerd news of the week. Ben Affleck, Batman, thoughts? As I said in the 5 Stupid Things video I posted on Monday of this week, I am a fan of Ben Affleck as an actor and as a director as well. I think he's turned out to be a really good filmmaker. And I've always liked him as an actor. I liked him in Chasing Amy. I liked him in his supporting role in Good Will Hunting. I've liked him in a lot of stuff. So I'm not really that upset about Ben Affleck playing Batman just because it's Affleck. My problem with it is, number one, it's uncreative. It feels like they're just putting a movie star into a prominent role because they can't be bothered to really find a creative casting choice. And so they pick a guy who has the body type, who has the look, and they just say, oh, Affleck, here, he'll be Batman. That's a big problem with it. And also, it doesn't matter who plays Batman if the movie is a shitty movie. And as far as I know, at this point, there's not even a script for it. There's just a concept. I mean, we don't even know, I don't think anybody knows what part Batman is going to play in the movie, what the story is going to be, anything like that. And if the movie is like its predecessor, Man of Steel, it's not going to be very good, and it's not going to be Ben Affleck's fault. The problem isn't who plays Batman. The problem is who's writing and directing the movie. And I don't have confidence in the writers, in the writer and the director of this movie. I don't think Zack Snyder did a very good job at all with Man of Steel. I don't think David Goyer did a very good job at all writing Man of Steel. So, I mean, I hope it's good. I hope the next one is better. I hope that Affleck does a good job as Batman. And I hope I like Man of Steel 2 or whatever they end up calling it much better than I liked Man of Steel. But I predict that if it turns out to be a shitty movie, it's not going to be Ben Affleck's fault. Here's one from Cheeky Vimto 08, the richly deserving recipient of last week's shoutout. Here's my question. What are some arguments for atheism, or perhaps for some other related position you hold strongly, that you reject, and why? Reject might be too strong of a word, but I don't find purely philosophical arguments particularly compelling. There are some really interesting philosophical arguments for atheism, against the existence of God. And I think that they can make really interesting conversations. I think it can be really fun to talk about them, either with fellow atheists or with theists, or you can kind of argue back and forth. But ultimately, I don't think any philosophical argument against the existence of God is all that compelling to me. My atheism is based on the lack of empirical evidence for God and the lack of explanatory necessity for God. We have no reasons to believe that God exists, and there's no reason why he would have to exist for anything to make sense. That's why I'm an atheist. And you can come up with all kinds of very clever philosophical arguments against the existence of God. And one of the things that people often will do, and usually it's just to prove a point. Most of the times when people do this, they're not really arguing that it's a really good reason to disbelieve. It's just to make a point about the weakness of the opposing argument. When people will take a philosophical argument for the existence of God and turn it around to make it a philosophical argument against the existence of God. Like you can do that with the presuppositional argument. You can craft a version of the presuppositional argument where the necessary presupposition is the non-existence of God rather than the existence of God. You can craft a version of the moral argument where you could say that the existence of morality in fact implies that there is no God rather than requires that there is a God. I mean, you can take all the sort of philosophical arguments for the existence of God and flip them around and rephrase them to make them about the non-existence of God. And like I say, that's fun. I mean, I enjoy that. I think it makes for really interesting conversations. But ultimately, I just don't think those arguments are very compelling. I need more than that. You know, if I'm going to have a belief about the nature of reality, about whether something exists or doesn't exist, I need more than just a philosophical argument for or against it. I need something a little bit more that I can sink my teeth into, something a little more science-based, a little more empirically based. And that's why I wouldn't say I reject them, but the closest thing to like really major arguments for atheism that I do reject are the purely philosophical arguments, just because other than making for interesting conversation, I really don't have any use for them. Here's one from Isaac Barlow. Hi Steve, love the show. Do you think that it's harder to come out as an atheist or gay? Would love to hear your thoughts. My impression is very much that it is still a lot harder to come out as gay. There are a lot more social stigmas and social pressures against being openly gay, even today in our much more progressive and enlightened culture than there are for being an atheist. And I am fortunate that I've never really had to face either situation because I'm heterosexual, and when I started telling people I was an atheist, there wasn't really a coming out phase. I just sort of started telling people I was an atheist. I wrote an article on my blog, I started making videos on YouTube, and I just sort of, hey, I'm an atheist. And and I just didn't treat it as that big of a deal. And I didn't have to. I was fortunate that I was in a situation where I didn't have to worry about having consequences from an employer or from family or whatever. I was free to come out, as it were, and not have to worry about it. So I don't have personal experience with the difficulty of that. I know that there are horribly, horribly just wrenching experiences of people coming out as atheists to their families and becoming estranged or having a great deal of conflict as a result of their atheism. And of course, I'm sure we've all heard stories about people coming out as gay and having to deal with being treated absolutely horribly by people because of that. So I think there are anecdotes from both experiences that make it sound just absolutely horrible. But on the whole, in general, I still think it's worse. It's a more daunting experience to come out as gay. I think even though we've come very far, and in a very short period of time, toward gay tolerance and gay acceptance, LGBT equality, it's still much more daunting to come out as a gay person, and it's still much more difficult to be an openly gay person than it is to be an openly atheistic person, I think. Marc Norton, do you think that the contest/sports motif limits the storytelling possibilities of wrestling? The only real MacGuffin they have is the belt. This is one of the reasons I lost interest in wrestling. Characters/gimmicks like Taker and Foley's multiple personalities are fascinating because they seemed to be motivated by other things. One thing that made Stone Cold popular, besides Redneck, is that it was a great blue-collar versus white-collar storyline. Andy Kaufman made me a wrestling fan. It depends, I think, on what aspects of pro wrestling really attract you to it. If you are attracted primarily to the storylines and to the gimmicks or the characters, as they are more often called today by WWE especially, then yeah, I think you have a point. I think if you're looking at it as a form of storytelling in the same way that you would look at film or literature or theater, then yeah, it's very limited because they're wrestlers and their main motivation is to wrestle each other, to win matches, to gain championships, to make money, etc. But my main attraction to wrestling has always been the matches themselves. I mean, I appreciate a good storyline as much as anybody, and I agree with you. I mean, Undertaker is a great gimmick. Mick Foley's gimmicks, Cactus Jack and Mankind and Dude Love, and then basically now he's just sort of himself. Great gimmicks. They really contributed to the stories surrounding the matches. Stone Cold Steve Austin, great gimmick, great storyline of, you know, the little guy fighting the machine, Austin versus McMahon, worker versus boss. Yeah, absolutely. Great, great stuff. And go back into the 80s. I mean, the classic, the storyline that surrounded that classic trio of Steamboat versus Flair matches. Again, a very basic, very evocative storyline of Steamboat as the family man, the good guy, the sort of not necessarily working class, but just like the honest, hardworking guy versus Ric Flair, who was the champion, and the rich guy and the guy leading the extravagant lifestyle. It was sort of simplicity versus opulence, and that was very powerful too. But to me, it all has to lead to the matches. I don't think that there should be, to my taste as a wrestling fan, I really don't think there should be such a thing as a wrestling storyline just for the sake of telling a story. I think it has to lead to a match. That's just where I come from as a fan. That's just what appeals to me as a wrestling fan is the match. And if you can come up with a storyline that builds interest in a match, that puts the match in a context, that makes the outcome more interesting, that gives us more of a reason to care who wins and loses or what happens, that to me is the ultimate purpose of a storyline in wrestling. It's not to tell a story for the sake of drama, for the sake of revealing character and teaching us all something about the human condition. It's much more basic to me as a wrestling fan. I don't look to wrestling for the same things that I look to film or theater or literature for. I look at wrestling because I like wrestling matches. And so yeah, it depends on where you're coming from as a fan. If you're into the storylines, then yeah, it can be very limiting just by its nature. But if you look at it from my perspective as someone who is really into the matches, then it's, you want the storylines to be sort of limited to building up the matches. I will say I totally agree with you with Andy Kaufman, by the way. Even though the matches in that Andy Kaufman-Jerry Lawler feud in Memphis are not very good, just because Kaufman wasn't actually a proper wrestler, that storyline was amazing. That's one of the greatest pro wrestling storylines I have seen. And that was almost pure storyline. That's one of the few exceptions I can think of where I, as a fan who cares more for matches, will say that was just absolutely outstanding stuff, which was not carried by matches. It was carried by the storyline. It was carried by the conflict between the two characters, between Lawler and Kaufman, and Jimmy Hart was in there too, and it was just so good. Sort of like the wrestling soap opera at its best, that it didn't rely on the in-ring action. But that's an exception. Most of my favorite wrestling storylines are built around great matches. Calamantius, hi Steve, following your request, I'll go through the awkwardness of asking my question again. Biotechnologies in the food industry is a subject I'm particularly involved in. Here in Europe, entire fields of research are blocked due to the huge ideological pressure. What are your views on the anti-GMO movement? Cheers, mate. I am not an anti-GMO person. I am not an alarmist about genetically modified foods. I don't see any reason to be making a big deal out of it. People, most of the pressure in this country about GMOs is just for labeling, just so people will know whether a given food that they're buying is genetically modified or not. And I don't have a problem with that, but I don't really care either way. I'm not satisfied that there's anything dangerous or harmful about them. I think that it's a bit alarmist for people to be making a big deal of it. But at the same time, if they want genetically modified foods to be labeled as such just for consumer knowledge, just for transparency, that I don't have a problem with that. That's fine. But I personally don't care. David Gagnon, is that a Dark Shadows shirt you are wearing? It looks like Barnabas Collins. No, that was not a Dark Shadows shirt I was wearing last week. I'll show you what that shirt was that I wore in the previous video. It was this shirt right here, and it's not Barnabas Collins. It is actually Daniel Bryan, or perhaps Bryan Danielson would be more accurate. This is a t-shirt of Bryan Danielson back when he was an indie wrestler, before he was Daniel Bryan in the WWE. He's my favorite wrestler at the moment. I can't say a single bad thing about him. He's everything I would want a pro wrestler to be. He's amazing in the ring. He's great on the mic. He does everything good, and I wish him nothing but the greatest success. And this is a shirt that I got. I got it recently, but it's an old design. It's from when he was an indie guy, and it is the Obama-ized Daniel Bryan or Bryan Danielson portrait with violent underneath of it. And already one of my favorite shirts. I just absolutely love it because he is my favorite wrestler, and I've been a fan of his since before he was a WWE guy, when he was working the independents and working Ring of Honor, and he's just absolutely my favorite guy, and I could not be more thrilled about his success. So no, not Dark Shadows. It was just a fucking geeky ass wrestling shirt. Question all the things. Hey Steve, why the vitriol for Dungeons and Dragons nerds? People can be nerdy about all kinds of things, video games, Star Trek, pro wrestling, but why are D&D nerds losers and the others not? Or am I just being oversensitive? I think you're being oversensitive, but then again, I'm the guy who said it, so maybe you should take what I say with a grain of salt. I will point out that even though I did have harsh words for D&D nerds last week, and even though I will say there's just something about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general that I just don't get, that I find them just to be complete wastes of time. But keep in mind, as you said, I dig Star Trek, I dig pro wrestling, I dig superhero comics. I have written fan fiction in the past. I mean, there are all sorts of things that I really like that are thought to be wastes of time by lots of other people. And in fact, in that very video, when I was taking a shit on Dungeons and Dragons nerds, don't forget, I was wearing this fucking pro wrestling t-shirt of a current wrestling star, but it's a picture of him when he was an indie wrestler, because that's just what a fucking piece of shit, full of shit hipster that I am. Okay, so just maybe I rag on hipsters too. See, I wear a T-shirt that a hipster wrestling fan would wear, and I take shits on hipsters too. I look down on hipsters too. So possibly, maybe what I'm saying is, I hope that my open, blatant, unforgivable hypocrisy in this area will be of some comfort to you. S.E. Jones, hey Steve, love your stuff. Had a question that I'd be very interested to know your thoughts on. I've been arguing with some person on the comments for the video Rise of the New Atheists, and I was taken aback by how obsessed and repulsed this guy was with the notion that human beings are animals. Why do you think that the fact that human beings are animals is so difficult to stomach for some religious thinkers? Is it simply that they feel this devalues the uniqueness of the human experience? Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the reason why being thought of as animals is so offensive to them, and why they do feel that it devalues their humanity, is because their sense of pride and of specialness and uniqueness comes from their belief that they were created specially in the image of God. You could make an argument for the specialness, for the uniqueness of the human species from an evolutionary standpoint. You could say, well, we appear to be the only species capable of large-scale engineering. We appear to be the only species capable of really complex, abstract thought. We have, as far as we can tell, the most sophisticated language, the most sophisticated cultures, the most sophisticated ability to build institutions. We have education, we have art, we have literature, we make movies, we do all these things that no other animal on the planet can do. And those are reasons based on accomplishment, based on evolution, based on things that humanity can do or has done to think of it, to think of our species as special or unique. But that's not why many religious people think that we are special and unique. They think that we're special and unique solely because we were created in the image of God. And if you show them scientific proof that that did not happen, that we are the product of evolution the same as the other animals, that takes that they are robbed of that. I personally think that I would rather be an animal. I would rather be the product of evolution just like the other animals, because I think that what gives me a feeling of meaning and of nobility and of specialness is the fact that even though we are unique in our humanity, we are also connected to the other forms of life on this planet, and not in a goofy, like, New Age mystical sense. Literally, we're literally related to each other and to the other organisms on the planet genetically through our DNA. We are tied together biologically in a real physical way. That to me is just so awesome, and is so much more beautiful and ennobling than the really archaic, silly, imagined religious idea that we were created magically by a God who made us look just like him, and that's why we're special, because we were created specially. That's a really silly, childish notion to me, and I reject it. I much prefer, both for poetic reasons and for scientific reasons, the way things are, that we are the product of evolution. And one of the things we've been evolved to do is to react that way when we hear thunder, because thunder means lightning, and lightning means that it's time for
the lightning round. Rapid fire questions, glib and adequate answers.
Tomcat 53. Okay, you said not to apologize for asking a question multiple times, so here goes again. The scar near your right eye, what's the story behind it? I was 3 years old and I fell out of my mother's car and cut the side of my face on the edge of a seatbelt. Now you know. I think I mentioned that before. Alan Key 86. Steve, would you rather have fingers as long as your legs or legs as long as your fingers? Fingers as long as my legs. You think I'm going to give up being tall? Fuck that. Gilatra. Suppose you were a movie character. Who would play you? Ben Affleck. Mr. Hi, or however the fuck you pronounce that. I think Steve would look awesome wearing sunglasses. Will you wear glasses in the next video? If you think that's cool, you should see me catch a fish in my mouth. Zozan and KPX. Hey Steve, don't know if this has been asked yet, but what is your favorite car? By the way, my name is pronounced Zozan and KPX. Yeah, I know, I apologize. Last time I answered your question, I think I pronounced it KPX or something. Like that was just a misspeak on my part. My favorite car, I don't really have a favorite car. I don't really care about cars. But when I was little, I had a model of a 1963 red Corvette Stingray with a split window in the back. So by default, that is my favorite car. Even though, honestly, I really don't care. Old Comic 1. I'm asking this for the second time since I know it's okay. I often hear you talk about your favorite films and great movies. I'd like to hear your 5 worst mainstream movies of all time. Boy. Well, let's see. Batman and Robin... Spawn, Star Wars Attack of the Clones, that's pretty fucking terrible. What else? Let me see. Oh, Lost in Space, that was fucking dog shit. What's another one? What would be a good 5th one for like a really terrible mainstream movie? Oh, Armageddon. There you go. Armageddon was just fucking terrible. As you can probably tell, I have a special loathing in my movie critic's heart for really big, like super big budget blockbuster movies that fail. There's a special place in movie hell for those, I think. Especially if they fail in a way that's not very entertaining. Radical Bacon, do you cook? Oh yeah. Dr. Themo, hey Steve, do you think pornography is inherently sexist? Yes. Adderall Apocalypse, who does the voiceover for the lightning round? That's not you, is it? Yeah, it's me. It's me with the pitch lowered about, I think, 5% and some sound effects added. John the Great, as an occasional pot smoker on a hardcore Nixon-Reagan-style conservative family, would you deem it ethically acceptable to lie to your parents? Yeah, and even if you weren't a pot smoker in a Nixon-Reagan-style family, I think there are probably lots of reasons why it would be ethically acceptable for a child to lie to their parents. Anthony Asuega, Steve, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? African or European? You knew that was coming. Hey, that's it for the questions this week. Before I go, I want to give a shout out, and the shout out this time around goes to the very deserving Christopher Maute, the host of Meeting of the Minds on New Covenant Group's USTREAM channel every Sunday, and I was privileged to be Christopher's guest on an episode of Meeting of the Minds last week, and not only was I his guest on Meeting of the Minds that day, but a few hours later, he also got to interview Aaron Ra live on USTREAM, and so it was a pretty big day for Christopher, wasn't it? He got to talk to this, you know? I didn't get to talk to Aaron Ra. So anyway, on his YouTube channel, he posts the recordings of Meeting of the Minds interviews. He has some other things on there too. He has a few videos, Meeting of the Minds interviews that weren't aired on the live USTREAM channel. It's really good stuff. He's a really good interviewer and a great person to have a conversation with. I had a really great time when I was on Meeting of the Minds with him. And the Aaron Ra show I also watched and was just excellent. And he's just a great dude and a really sharp guy. We see eye to eye on a lot of things as far as the atheist community and atheism versus theism. We both favor discussion and conversation. And he's just a really interesting guy and an interesting YouTube channel that I think is worthy of your attention. So check out Christopher Maute's YouTube channel. I don't think that you will be sorry. So there you go. But if you are sorry, I absolve myself of all responsibility. Because it's not my channel. Anyway, that's it for this week. Thank you as always for watching. Please leave a comment on this video with your question for next time. Ask me anything about anything. Nothing is too serious. Nothing is too silly. I will answer as many questions as I possibly can in the next video. I will see you then, and until then, have a good one.